Hi, ladies. Nice to speak to you again, even in the online world. So we're just going to cover the next section on CC13, which is fiscal policies and supply side policies. And we've covered quite a few of the free market supply side policies. We're just going to finish these off and then look at the interventionist side, and then hopefully combine those two by looking at some of the advantages and disadvantages of each. So that's the plan for this presentation. Okay, I've planned for you to have a look at this on Monday afternoon in the double. So that's Monday the 8th of Feb. So let's just crack on. Now I'm just going to revisit some of the stuff that we looked at the end of the last presentation, just to sort of give it some context. We were looking at privatisation and deregulation, and I'd ask you to take a look at some of the benefits of why the Royal Mail had been privatised when it was privatised back in 2013. Now, again, to try to give you an idea of how you might like to go about answering a question in this sort of area, I gave you a simple structure, which was obviously noting down the benefits of privatisation, in general terms, but also specifically for the Royal Mail, and also some of the drawbacks, and using that as a means to come up with a balanced argument and then come up with a judgment for that whole area. So in terms of some of the benefits then, and I'd ask you to take a look at an article on The Guardian, all about Royal Mail and the stock exchange and privatisation, which sort of sums up the whole area or whole time of privatisations that seemed to be constantly in the news over the course of the late 80s and into the early 90s. So let's take a look at this in a bit more detail then. So benefits of Royal Mail being privatised, well, clearly, as far as the government is concerned, and to some degree we as taxpayers, the Royal Mail would be no longer competing with other public services such as health for government investment. So clearly it allowed the government to use taxes to a larger degree to make sure that societal requirements were, right at the top of the pecking order in terms of gaining resources. So the Royal Mail would no longer be fighting for those public services. Clearly, given that it was at the time quite a successful business and quite a profitable business, that meant that it would be able to access capital markets instead of having to wait for the government to give it a handout, and so that would allow it to borrow funds for investment. And also, clearly, the profit incentive in the private sector should encourage more efficiency, possibly more innovation, and also just generally less likely to be customer exploitation going on, because the private sector and the profit motive and the nature of competition in that market would certainly mean that it would have to become more efficient to become successful, maintain its success. So other benefits and some of the possible drawbacks that you could have drawn out as well. Well, some of the benefits of privatisation, as we talked about before, is more to do with structure of markets and where we've got oligopolistic markets or monopoly power positions that organisations might hold. Well, privatisation is about becoming more efficient, okay? So in certain markets, because obviously more competition means that you can't just charge what you want, means you're going to have to innovate, means you have to become more efficient to stay competitive. And that clearly should lead to an increase in the quality and choice of products and services, which is going to be a benefit to the consumer. It also means that lower prices should be achieved, because as soon as you get competition into a market, then that generally means that consumers will benefit from greater choice and also lower prices. However, a few things that we could bear in mind in terms of balancing up that argument. There is an argument to say that in certain situations, privatisation doesn't always necessarily lead to greater competition, particularly where you've got companies that might have natural monopolies like the telecoms infrastructure or gas pipes or the rail network, and effectively that doesn't necessarily mean that's going to, just because it gets privatised, doesn't mean you're going to get competition flooding into those marketplaces, because those markets aren't necessarily that easily contestable. Would be a significant barrier to entry for any organisation that wanted to set up a telecoms infrastructure that was competing with BT, for instance. And clearly those situations, sometimes, whilst privatisation might seem like a good idea, sometimes it's not necessarily going to work. One of the other issues is that once you've sold off a nationalised firm, you can't do it again. Once you've done that, you basically might gain a short-term gain in terms of the amount of money you might raise from the share offerings, but fundamentally, any revenue that the government was receiving from the nationalised firm in the past means that they're not going to be gaining that revenue or that profit in the future. Now, clearly, you could argue that if the business remains positive and profitable, then the government will receive some tax, but clearly they won't receive all of the revenue and profit that the organisation is making, because that it would just be a proportion of that based on the corporation tax rate at the time. And another thing is, and this also is a fair comment, in some cases you might find that if you just privatise without really considering some of the implications, you might find that there's too much industrial fragmentation. So, for instance, when the rail network or when the railways were privatised, obviously you've got the issue around the track and the rolling stock, and also the privatised companies or the private companies that have been bidding for the various rail franchises. And so, as a classic example, the railways are quite a difficult thing to manage because of the nature of what they're trying to do, and also the fact that there are these different organisations that have different responsibilities, and that fragmentation can be quite difficult and quite dangerous in some cases. So that's something to bear in mind too. So hopefully you can see by watching the document, looking at the article in the Guardian, and I believe there are some live links which actually go to add to your understanding as far as that case study is concerned. You've also got a breakdown of the way in which you might argue about privatisation and the reasons for it, and also some of the potential drawbacks as a result. So let's move on then. Okay, so more drawbacks then. Okay, this is again a clip that I'd like you to take a look at, and this was to do with the Potters Bar train crash, which some of you may be familiar with. It was back in 2002, and it was proven that that which caused a number of fatalities, and it was a terrible thing that happened. That was caused by poor track maintenance, and at the time, that was actually the tracks were actually owned and organised and managed by a company called Railtrack at the time. And there's a link there for you to take a look at, which again hopefully explains some of the whys and wherefores of that whole process. Okay, so we looked at privatisation. One of the other things that we need to bear in mind as well is that effectively, in some cases, there is some deregulation going on in these markets. Okay, so there may be some privatisation, but also effectively you're going from a situation where, in some cases, the free market may be actually, to some degree, allocating resources. But in this instance, if we're talking about nationalised industries where the government is the main sort of resource provider, I suppose, for those organisations, that sometimes can cause its own set of issues. So deregulation and to some degree regulation is to do with, in some cases, if we're talking about deregulation, it's about removing restrictions to the free working of markets, and in other instances, it might mean that if we're actually providing a different market structure, and in some cases that might mean a natural monopoly is still holding the main monopoly power in a market, or not even necessarily natural monopolies, but any organisation like the Royal Mail, for instance, that was in a monopoly position has to some degree, if we're going to open that up to competition, number one, it's going to need some deregulation, but also it may need some regulation to make sure that the Royal Mail isn't going to be able to exploit its previous position of being the only game in town, so to speak. So there's the whole range of and quite complicated issues around regulation and deregulation of markets. Okay, so if we take as one example, when the Royal Mail was basically one of the things that as part of the privatisation process, that the Royal Mail still had to make sure they delivered anywhere within the UK, mail within anywhere within the UK within a certain time frame. And obviously, the partial deregulation of markets that the Royal Mail were working in has helped to actually encourage more businesses to move into that market space. And obviously, competition has been very healthy for that marketplace in terms of consumer satisfaction, etc. But also, there is an issue around making sure that it is fair for all, and that's what the regulation or deregulation process is about. We take another example, and that's included in your booklet on page 39. This is in CC13, which is fiscal policy and supply side policies. So page 39, there is an example of the deregulation of buses in the UK, and that basically was where bus services had been run by local authorities and licensed operators, and they had pretty much monopoly power on all routes. And that actually changed significantly when it was changed so that any company could run buses on routes after 56 days notice. So again, trying to encourage competition to try and make markets work more effectively, those that were monopoly markets, was what all of this was about, really. A couple of other examples of deregulation where it was about trying to release the stranglehold that somebody might have had, or a business might have had, or an organisation had in a particular market. So back in 1986, the UK stock market and other financial markets in the UK were introduced, so they were deregulated, okay? And that was one of the main reasons why the City of London has grown to be such a successful financial market centre, okay? The deregulation of the air industry in the EU in 1997 meant that an airline from any EU country could operate within any other European country, okay? So again, to some degree, it's about deregulation, is about trying to bring more competition and all the benefits that competition should bring to what might have been an imperfect market structure, and that was designed to try to encourage greater efficiency, more consumer choice, and obviously less exploitation of consumers in terms of prices being charged that were too high. Okay, so some of the potential benefits of deregulation then. At the bottom of page 39, you've got some listed, and these are encouraging competition. Firms need to cut costs to compete, and as a result, that should actually be of benefit both to the firms because they're productively more efficient, but also it should mean that consumers should benefit from lower prices. Okay, and obviously more consumer choice or customer choice. That could also, to some degree, attract more foreign direct investment, and obviously reduces the potential for government failure, because if we're saying that the market will look after itself and manage itself, then to some degree you could argue that then a lack of government intervention, or no intervention, or less intervention that was previously going on, is going to be a good thing for all. Now, the other examples then, okay, thinking about how we might look at evaluation or possible drawbacks of deregulation, and obviously you can have a go at some of those yourself, but please do so if you want to stop the presentation here and have a go at trying to fill in that box at the bottom of page 39, and we'll come back together and have a chat about some of the options in a moment. Okay, so let's take a look then at some of the issues that we may be facing when we're talking about deregulation. Okay, so in some cases, as we mentioned before, if we've got a natural monopoly, so where we've got very high barriers to entry into a market, okay, it can be sometimes quite difficult to create effective competition, and to some degree, the deregulation may create a private firm with monopoly power. So effectively, if we've got somebody who's decided that they really want to move into a market that's being deregulated, they might get into a position where they have significant market share, and that deregulation could actually create a private firm with monopoly power. And clearly, most private firms have profit maximization as their main objective, and if that scenario happens in a monopoly position, then that could lead to exploitation of consumers and higher prices. So that's clearly not something that we would necessarily want to happen if we were going to try and go through this deregulation process in order to bring competition into previously monopoly based or nationalized markets. Clearly, in some cases as well, if we got deregulation, this could essentially lead to a compromise of public services with poorer quality provision. So chances are that a privately owned profit maximizing organisation isn't necessarily going to look at all of the really good societal things that they could choose to do. And in some cases, that might mean that if we're talking about public services, that might actually mean that the public services aren't quite so profitable, aren't actually held with such great regard, and maybe as a result less well provided for, if that makes sense. So that's a bit about privatisation, and explains in a wee bit more detail about privatisation and deregulation and how that could help in some cases to address some of these issues as far as supply side policies are concerned. Okay, if we take a look at the next example, then reducing the minimum wage. Okay, so remember in this case, if that could be a free market supply side policy. Okay, by reducing the minimum wage, that could actually help to improve the supply side as far as the free market is concerned. So we know a little bit about the national living wage and the national minimum wage because we've covered it previously. And obviously this is a moving feast because there's much discussion on the levels of minimum wage and why they're put in place, in some cases for very good reason, to try to address the issue of inequality and distribution of wealth and income. But there is an argument to say that actually businesses and firms might choose to actually look at reducing the minimum wage, and that would actually improve their costs of production, and then and as a result of that, maybe the supply level that they could achieve. So it is a statutory minimum. Okay, so there's a law against anybody paying less than that, and as you can see, it varies from age to it. So basically, if we take anybody 25 and over, the current rate at 2018 was $7.83. In April 2019, it went up to $8.21, and the minimum wage for 2020 for a 25 and over is £8.72. So you can see that over the last couple of years, it's gone up by a factor of let's see, so it's gone up by nearly £1 in that last year and a half, hasn't it? So that's the hourly rate. So clearly that has a significant impact on wage bills if you've got a number of people who are on minimum wage. So obviously the minimum wage is a form of intervention in the labour market to some degree, and as you can imagine, for some low-paid occupations, it may raise the wage above the equilibrium level, and that clearly has an impact, or will have an impact. Okay, so what would the impacts be then? Well, again, this is something that we've looked at before. So if we're talking about, in this instance, our original market equilibrium, where we're talking about the quantity of labour being required and the wage rate that is going to get paid. So we're talking about original market equilibrium at Q and quantity of labour demanded at Q, and the wage rate at W. If we're saying the minimum wage would be higher than that, higher than our equilibrium price, then effectively that is going to affect both the amount of demand for labour and also, in this case, the amount that the amount will be that is willing to, who are willing to supply their labour in that situation. So if we then take a look at that and break that down in a bit more detail, this is how the minimum wage increasing or changing might impact both employment and unemployment. Because if you think about it, in this situation, we'd have a situation where we've got the quantity of labour supplied at Q2 would actually exceed the quantity demanded at Q1, and that would essentially increase the level of unemployment, because although more people would be willing to work at that higher wage, the quantity demanded, because obviously businesses will have not necessarily have unlimited amounts of money to spend on wages, would then have an effect on the level of employment that they would choose to be working at. Okay, so if we're talking about reducing the minimum wage then, and again, this is based on supply side policies, free market supply side policies, some of the benefits would be, for firms, it would be cheaper for them to employ workers, because that would reduce the wage rate. So that would then effectively mean that lower cost of production would be available to firms, and so shorter and aggregate supply would shift to the right. That would mean that firms could employ more workers, and also it would increase the total number in employment. And that would, as far as the free market is concerned, would then mean that UK firms would be more competitive, simply because they've reduced their cost of production by the amount that the reduced minimum wage has allowed them to. Okay. However, there are clearly some drawbacks to that. So obviously we've got some positive reasons for it, as far as improving the supply side of the economy is concerned, as far as the free market is concerned. However, one of the big issues is, as we've just said, is that we've got greater inequality and lower standing of living for some workers. Okay, so the individuals who are having to accept a lower minimum wage would clearly be have greater wage inequality and a lower standard of living in some instances. Okay, if we've got more workers' wages, they may got more workers on that lower level. They may need to have their wages subsidised by government tax credits, or by some form of universal credit of some description, if they're not able to look after themselves and their families, etc. Okay. Might also reduce the incentive to work, because if that minimum wage is lower, it might mean that people will choose to go on to benefits as a result, and that could then increase the rate of economic inactivity. And that clearly, if we think about this in the grander scheme of things, if we've got, in this case, less money available, less disposable income available, and also we're getting an increased rate of economic inactivity, that could have a negative effect on consumption and aggregate demand too, because, as we've said before, most of the extra money that the increased minimum wage might have provided to people on lower wages would probably have gone straight on consumption and aggregate demand rather than into savings. So one could argue that would be having a negative effect on consumption and aggregate demand. Okay, so that's a little bit on reducing the minimum wage, and obviously that's something to bear in mind effectively. Okay, so the next thing to look at then is reducing trade union power. So this is point number 5 on page 41 in your booklets. Okay, so as some of you will know, some of you historians will know, and some of you that might have studied trade unions and the power of the trade unions and how that's changed over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years. The argument is that reducing trade union power as far as firms is concerned would be a possible positive as far as supply side, improving the supply side of the economy is concerned. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the background behind that and how that might work. Okay, so obviously since the 80s, it's the UK and other countries have made it harder for trade unions to call strikes in opposition to pay offers and changing working conditions. Okay, now, so although less working days are now lost from disputes, and so output per worker has actually risen, there is an argument to say that that's not necessarily a good thing. But if we take a look at the working days lost, in terms of where we were in the very late 70s, all the way through to 2011, as the graph shows, a significant fall in the level of the number of working days lost. Now, clearly, there's an argument to say that this period of time has covered quite an interesting time in terms of the economic climate that's been prevailing over that time, and that obviously might have an impact on how people feel about number one, choosing to use their option to strike, and also the fact that obviously where we have been in recession for parts of that time, that clearly could have had an impact on that too. But reducing trade union power has been put forward by free market supply side policymakers as a means of actually improving supply side. So the next thing to take a look at then, and I know I'm going through this reasonably quickly, and it's something that we have looked at in a bit of detail previously, but another option would be to reform the benefit system. Okay, so and to be honest, that has happened, as we probably are aware. It was quite complicated and quite difficult to get your heads around job seekers allowance and ESA and income support and housing benefit and various other different types of benefit, and that has been replaced by universal credit, which obviously has had its critics, but effectively one of the reasons why the reforms to the benefit system have happened is because the whole reason for it is to try to actually address some of the issues around real incomes and reducing poverty. But the process is quite a complicated one and quite difficult to administer and quite expensive. And so there is an argument to say that by simplifying that process, then that actually could make a big difference. Now, obviously, in some cases, there are always instances where there are individuals that may feel that they've been badly done by around this universal credit process. But some of the benefits are, or some of the reasons why the government might like the idea of it, is that actually it would reduce the amount of government expenditure that's spent on social security. It's running at around about 13% of GDP, which is a significant slice of any government budget, isn't it? Okay, but when we're talking about 13% of gross domestic product is spent on social security and the benefit system, that is a significant amount of money that is being used there that it can't be used in other places. So the whole reason for reforming the benefit system was to make it a simpler thing to apply for, and to reduce administration costs, and obviously to increase the incentive to work. Okay, so that clearly if we could as a government provide a greater incentive to work, and for people to come out of benefits and into paid work, then that clearly would be a good thing to do, both for individual workers, but also for the society and for the economy as a whole. Could also potentially increase the size of the potential workforce, okay, which obviously would be a good thing. However, as with any of these things, whenever we're talking about social policy in particular, there are some drawbacks to this welfare reform. Okay, the IT system has been very difficult, very complex, and it's cost an awful lot to develop. So one could argue that maybe the savings that have been made on the fact that not so much is being paid might actually be countered by the amount of IT requirement to actually make this work. Now, in some cases, as we said before, some families have actually effectively had their benefits cut, particularly if we're talking about those that are living in expensive accommodation in London, in some instances where they need to be in order to get work. It does require internet access for all claimants, so the argument is that if somebody hasn't got internet access, that's going to mean that they're going to find it very difficult to claim, and in some cases may choose not to claim because it's just too difficult to get access to that. And the benefits freeze or a benefit freeze has led to greater inequality, and that clearly has been demonstrated by a number of different examples where whenever there's a change of this nature, there tends to be, well, some winners and some losers, but more often than not, the media will focus on the losers because that seems to be a stronger story than maybe some of the winners, perhaps. But so that covers pretty much the 6 different ways in which we can look at the free market and free market supply side policies. Okay, now on page 42, before we move on to interventionist supply side policies, there is also an article on page 41, 42 of your booklet, which looks at the IFS report on UK benefits, and that's summarised. And again, one of the things I'd like you to do is make sure you read that and be able to apply some of that information, which is pretty much summarised based on what we just talked about, but also use page 42 to fill in the benefits of welfare reform and some of the potential drawbacks too. Okay, so I think we'll move on and take a look at the interventionist examples, and then I think we'll stop. And so obviously there are some subtle differences between these two things. So we talked about the free market. Now we're looking at interventionist supply side policies. Okay, so these cover increased government spending on education and training, increased spending, government spending on infrastructure, stricter government competition policies, and policies to reduce geographical immobility of labour. Now, in essence, what we're saying, if we're talking about an interventionist approach, it's where the government is effectively intervening and providing support in some cases that is effectively changing the way in which the free market might choose to have allocated resources. And in some cases, there's some very good reasons for that, but we do need to be able to differentiate between the two. So let's take a look at each one of these in a little bit more detail. And we're now moving on to page 43 in your booklet. It's headed up as interventionist supply side policies. Okay, so first things first then, increased government spending on education and training. There's a whole raft of reasons why that is a good thing. And clearly, if we think about some of the principles and the reasons why the government might have chosen to support this process, is that you could argue that if it was left to the private sector or private organisations to provide education and training, then we may find that wouldn't necessarily be the most efficient way of making sure that we are actually improving the human capital of our economy and of our individuals within the economy. Okay, so clearly one of the things that the government is keen to do is to provide state funding for education, tax relief for businesses running training schemes, and the impact of that is really attempting to raise the level of human capital. Obviously, if we can do that and increase skill levels and the ability to work more quickly and accurately, that is going to improve the overall productivity of the nation too. Okay, and if we can improve the ability to solve problems and make decisions, again, that can only be a good thing, as well as improving teamwork. If we can get more flexible workers, more people well trained, resilient, and with a bunch of transferable skills, then clearly that has got to be a good thing for the overall economy. Okay, and the argument is that in this instance, our interventionist view is that if we left that to private organisations, there would be an under provision and under consumption of education and training, and hence that would be a form of market failure. And that's the reason that interventionist economists believe that that should be provided by the state. Okay, so that's a bit of a summary. Now, within your booklet, there is a significant chunk on the different types of interventionist education policy that might be included, including information on apprenticeships, the apprenticeship levy, and that goes into a reasonable level of detail. And then also there's quite a nice tutor to you reference on for apprenticeships and economic performance. Okay, so if we just move on and take a look at how that all looks, then Okay, that is broken down in the next couple of slides. So in this instance, we've got this situation where we've got this apprenticeship levy that is designed to try to encourage more people, more businesses to provide jobs that incorporate some form of on and off the job training. Okay, and those apprenticeships have changed significantly in the last few years, so that you can get not just those people that have left school with relatively poor level of academic qualifications, academic rather than economics, academic qualifications, but it's moved significantly now in that we've got high level apprenticeships, and it's a really good option for all to consider, really. So in this instance, there's a bit more detail on how that apprenticeship levy works, okay, and it's all about trying to encourage more businesses to provide more apprenticeships to ensure that, number one, staff that are coming into their organisations are better prepared for the jobs that they're going to be doing in the future, and obviously for people to feel that that is actually an investment they're willing to make in their staff. There are, as I mentioned before, there's some detail and a table on page 44 that I'd like you to have a go at filling in. So have a read through the content and highlight the bits that you think are relevant, particularly on the 600 million a year, which could be wasted on poor quality apprenticeships. So that I'd like you to take a look at and have a go at filling it. And you should see that there's a bit of a pattern emerging in terms of this particular booklet, where we're talking about examples of, in this case, a particular type of government reform, and what some of the advantages and what some of the disadvantages might have been. So getting you used to coming up with a balanced argument, providing evidence based on, in this case, a short case study that you can use to support your argument. Okay, so benefits of apprenticeships then, and this is included on the bottom of page 44. Clearly, one of the main benefits is it increases the skill levels of the working population. And that should then lead to employment prospects improving for a whole range of people. If we can do that, that should lead to an increase in the human capital of the individual and also overall within the economy. And that's clearly going to then lead to improvements in productivity and lower cost of production, etc., for businesses, and then that should lead to greater international and UK competitiveness, essentially. So let's take a look at some of the evaluative points then, as far as this area is concerned. So apprenticeships can be quite bureaucratic, and that in some cases makes firms not necessarily choose those options because it's just too much paperwork. In some cases, you find that some people who are offering apprenticeships haven't necessarily taken it that seriously, and they are basically just using it as a means of getting cheap labour, and that they're essentially abusing the system to suit themselves, which clearly is not a great scenario. It does seem that in some cases that more and more apprenticeships are going to older and more experienced workers. Now you could argue that's still a good thing because it's actually improving matters in terms of the overall skill set and human capital of the labour force, but it was designed very much for those who were struggling to get into jobs or struggling to get into work, and that's not necessarily where the money that was intended to go is. It seems to be making a difference. Okay. Still, even considering the amount of time and effort that's been put into the apprenticeship programs that exist, and some of them are very good, there is still a very high level of youth unemployment, which is obviously something that we all want to try and address. If we take a look at education, then there is clearly an opportunity cost for the government. Are there any other policies that could be more effective? The government at the moment provides 93% of all education, so is essentially a monopoly provider, and that could then impact on the quality of provision. Now, again, there's an argument to say that private businesses may just want to cherry pick and choose which bits that they might take on, and that might then mean that overall the overall quality of the provision may fall. But you could argue that because of what we talked about, if we're a monopoly provider, does that mean that the efficiency and the quality of the provision is at the point that it should be? Clearly, the other thing to bear in mind is that any change of this nature, when we're talking about the supply side, trying to improve supply side policies and the level of in this case, the level of improved education, even if we improve that level of education, that's going to take sometimes going to be a clear time lag between that investment in education and it being seen and felt within the economy. So time lag is clearly a good example of an evaluative point that you could use there. Okay, you could argue that the improvements in training might be felt more quickly because that's going to be closer to what is required within the organisation as opposed to, and obviously the training may be specifically designed to improve the way in which somebody might be doing the work that they're doing in the organisation. So one could argue that that might actually be a more beneficial short-term gain. Okay, so that's talking about government spending on education. We're now going to look at government spending and increasing government spending on infrastructure. Now, infrastructure basically is any physical system of transport, communications network, energy and water supply that form the basis of a functioning economy. And improving infrastructure clearly provides some significant gains. Now, that can be productivity gains in terms of time savings. It can be down to a more flexible and more mobile labour force if we've got better transport networks. It could mean lower costs for businesses to transport their goods, and it might mean that they can get their goods to market quicker than others. And it should also lead to a more competitive economy, hopefully attracting foreign direct investment as well. So all of those things will clearly be benefits that any government would want to try to gain some advantage from. Now, there is an example, a couple of really good examples that are included in your booklet on page 45. HS2 being a really good example, and I'll leave you to read the article on page 45 and also take a look at some of the other ways in which we can assess how successful some of those government spend infrastructure projects have been. They clearly, by their very nature, HS2 is a massively expensive process with all sorts of potential benefits, but one could argue that the significant amount of overspend that has gone on there, maybe if we looked at the opportunity cost of that, is that going to outweigh the gains that it's likely to provide? And that's something that obviously lots of you will have an opinion on, and obviously it's down to you to then use that information to then help you to argue one way or another. Okay, so a couple of other examples included here. One is the Crossrail project, a local bypass, so relatively local in Hampshire, which again has been allocated some money to but the one that I think probably is the one to take a look at in a bit more detail is HS2, which gives you and there's so much been written about, and there's loads of stuff that you can go and take a look at, which gives you quite a good grounding on, in this case, some of the issues that government might face on spending on infrastructure projects. Okay, so clearly in this instance, then we've got the HS2 example, which I've gone into in a little bit more detail there. So have a read of that on page 46. And then you've got, again, the opportunity to look at infrastructure projects and also some of the benefits and issues that clearly come into sharp focus when we're looking at significant amounts of government expenditure on infrastructure. So let's take a look at the next thing. Then we've got stricter government competition policy as the next area. Okay. Now, to some degree, that is all about trying to reduce and restrict monopoly power. So forcing firms to reduce their costs in order to maintain their profit. Okay. So in this instance, competition policy is about making industries more efficient. It can, in some cases, mean restricting mergers. Okay. So that could be seen as reducing competition and outlawing certain practices like price fixing. And if firms don't meet those rules, they can face significant fines. So that whole principle of encouraging competition to reduce monopoly power and to also make sure that markets innovate and businesses innovate within those areas and make sure that cost savings are passed on to the customer and lower costs, lower prices, and all the benefits of competition that effectively make sure that customers aren't going to be exploited. So obviously, the more that that happens, the more likelihood is that there's going to be greater innovation in marketplaces. And again, nice example of a very current one, which we've looked at in quite a bit of detail and talked about in class previously, and that was this issue of Sainsbury's and Asda potentially merging, but the Competition and Markets Authority deciding that it wasn't going to be a very good option to do that, and so they chose to block that. Okay, so that's one that again would prove quite useful and be a good one to have in your locker as an example. Okay, so the next thing then, and I think once we've done this, I think we'll stop and then we'll look at the examples of microeconomic supply-side policies and market-based versus interventionist-based policies after that, okay? So in this case, we're looking at reducing geographical immobility of labour. And in this case, this is about encouraging people to be able to move easily, to move into other areas of work within the country. Okay, so that can include providing more information on job vacancies or subsidies for worker relocation, more affordable housing in certain parts of the country, and also housing and ownership and house ownership for key workers like nurses, police and teachers. Each one of those is designed to try to actually encourage people to move to where the jobs are. So if there are not jobs available in the area that people are basing themselves in, then these measures are designed to try to actually encourage people to move further afield. And obviously, in some cases, that can work quite effectively. And there's a link that you can go and take a look at as far as that one is concerned too. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and then we'll move on and take a look at microeconomic supply-side policies and market-based versus interventionist supply-side policies as a separate, relatively short PowerPoint. So thanks for listening once again, and I'll catch up with you soon.